Hey, good morning and afternoon. My name is Maximilian Gebhardt. I'm a advisory solution consultant with our fraud action product line. And today we're going to be talking to you about a new phishing attack that's been observed by fraud action. We've called it phishing at ludicrous speed. I know it's a Spaceballs joke, but the focus here is very much to talk about a scalable phishing kit that we're seeing explosively grow within the US market that specifically targets not just American banks, but credit unions, small community banks, things that generally we don't actually see targeted by these sorts of phishing kits, and it can grow at scale. There are elements of it that appear to have Gen AI at the heart, especially chatbots, which are baked into some of these pages. And the overall concern that we have here is that the attack method that we're observing is not just focused on, say, some of the larger banks, which is something that we would actually expect to see from these sorts of high-end phishing kits, but instead is trying to focus down on more down market elements, credit unions, community banks, even small regional banks, in order to try to maximize their ability to target customers and target financial institutions that they might see a higher success rate from. So let's take it in and run through everything. So the actual attack mechanism from our perspective is not unique. The structures for the URL and for the phishing kit actually match something we've been observing since April of last year, specifically within the Canadian market. When we initially saw this type of phishing kit, the focus was on Interac, a Canadian person-to-person payment network, very similar to Zelle within the US, if you're not familiar with Interac. In those kind of cases, it was typically a funds received kind of scam. Since Interac does person-to-person payment, it wasn't unusual for someone to get a pending payment that they'd need to receive back at their bank and plug in details in order to do so. But what we saw shift for this one is that the interstitial has changed, and we've actually seen it leave Canada and hit a number of different markets. So we've seen it across Southeast Asia. I've seen it in Malaysia. I've seen it in Taiwan. But within the US market, the approach seems to be using Plaid as the interstitial. So rather than recreate every bank login page as part of the phishing kit, it's much more useful for them to use these kind of bank interactions, third-party integrations or aggregators, where customers are familiar with these flows, but they don't have to be unique to every bank. They are still customizing it just the way those integrations would appear to them in the normal flow, but it's not necessarily specifically targeted at the surface. It gets a little bit more interesting as we go down. Now, based on what we're seeing for the actual pages themselves, we do think that this is targeting either some kind of sweepstakes fraud or refund or money back fraud. So just to give you an example, in this case, it was captured as booking.com and it was a refund. But we've also seen versions that have come through that are promising some kind of a prize. So it's either that they've won a prize or they've won a gift card with booking.com or sometimes with an e-commerce provider. The lures vary and do change, but the overall methodology is very much the same. It's a node and a attack structure. So what we're actually seeing is that they're landing at these nodes which present whatever the lure is, and that is your refund, your sweepstakes, your prize. Either way, it's money to you as the victim. And at that point, once they select anything, it's taking them to the actual attack page. All of it is highly customizable. So what that means is that what's actually being featured for the bank selections is up to the fraudster, and they are changing it at will. So we're seeing multiple separate campaigns that are running on top of each other in order to target more banks or more customers, or to be more specifically targeted. Based on the nature of how we do detection, it's very difficult to figure out exactly what the lure is that's bringing them in or how targeted some of those lures are. But based on the pages that we're seeing, some of these are very region targeted or micro targeted in terms of what's going on. So it's not unusual when you're taking a look at some of the attack data, and you can see that there's a target list we were able to extract on the right, where in a normal phishing kit, I would expect to just see the largest banks in order, and it almost would look like an asset map of largest banks by asset. Instead, what we're seeing is I'm seeing situations where there are large banks that are being targeted. But within that scoping, I'm also seeing things like Police and Fire Federal Credit Union, which is a Philadelphia-based credit union. And that's being placed ahead of things like Charles Schwab or Ally in terms of who they might like to target. So normally I would expect to see the regional bank like Ally being higher targeted. I'd expect to see something like Charles Schwab as a national brand to be highly targeted. Instead, I'm seeing it much further down in the mix behind state-based credit unions or federal credit unions, community banks and small banks that normally would not feature in these kind of target lists. I'm even seeing versions of this where the actual bank selection is featuring these kind of smaller banks. So that tells us that they're highly targeting those customers in specific. There's some elements within the phishing kit that seem to have counters that are moving up, and we're seeing very much the same thing, where what appears to show us counters in traffic is reflecting back on these smaller banks and credit unions rather than the larger banks. So we're not actually seeing that much traffic for banks where I would expect to see high counter numbers. I'm not seeing a lot of Bank of America customers falling victim. I'm not seeing a lot of folks from Chase that are falling victim. Instead, what I'm seeing is a lot of these smaller banks that are actually falling victim. So it's highly targeted and highly focused. But the bigger concern I have is off of the sweepstakes and contest fraud aspect of this. So normally when we would see something like this, like a phishing attack, almost everyone's approach is going to go to account takeover as your primary concern. They're collecting credentials. The attack seems to be credential focused. Therefore, the focus must be account takeover. I think for most of us in the industry who've been dealing with fraud for a long time, we know that account takeover, while not a solved problem, is a very solved problem or mostly solved problem. We're not as concerned about a third party coming in as the customer and being undetectable. We have solutions, we have browser fingerprinting, we have approaches in order to tell the difference between our customer and someone else. But what we're seeing here is that they're interacting a lot more than just a standard phishing page. There is a chat bot that's enabled within the page as a little pop-up in the bottom right, a typical customer support chat bot. That is a Gen AI enabled chatbot, and it's willing to respond to them and build trust. It's willing to gather information off of them and interact with them as a potential customer or victim. When you combine that together with the fact that they clicked a phishing link in the first place and that they're being passed through in order to provide credentials, and based off of what we know about how often credentials are being lost and how often they're being reused and then combined together in data sets to create target lists or package lists of people who we want to target for scams, what this seems to be is not just an ATO target, but almost a scam target generator. By collecting credentials, now I know that this is the kind of person who falls victim to a refund scam or a sweepstakes scam. This is someone who's likely to believe in these kind of approaches. So this is someone who I want to come back to as a scammer to target more directly. You add in some of the focus on some of these smaller credit unions where I think the fraudster concern here, the fraudster interest is that these are organizations where they might not be as transaction focused or they might not be as focused on scam prevention. And I think that's really what's going on here. We're looking at scammers primarily who are using this as a method to create lists of who they want to target, not necessarily to enable account takeover. And then they're coming back in order to use that to go after these customers. So even if they were simply phished and we reset password, it doesn't eliminate the problem, which is that now the criminal knows that this is a more targetable individual, potentially gullible, and someone who they can come back to with more scams and more attempts. Not to phish them, not to replicate the bank or financial institution, but to come back with something that they know is going to work for them. A romance scam, a crypto scam, an investment scam, something else that's relying on that confidence and understanding that this is a consumer who's not necessarily going to see those red flags, since a few $100s in refund was enough to get them to lower all of their defenses. And based on what we know coming out of Southeast Asia, with large scam compounds that are highly organized, and if you want to go back and see one of our previous webinars on that topic, we did one in the fall. This is something where it's industrialized and is professionalized. So this is directly how they're feeding this kind of information back to their target lists. And just to give you a sense of scale. So I'd mentioned we've been seeing this in the Canadian market for over a year, and you can see that the Canadian market has some traffic, and that traffic has been very steady for this particular phishing kit going back. So they knew it worked, and they've been running it within the Canadian market. They've been running a few dozen phishing pages to sometimes as many as 100 phishing pages that'll pop up in a given month. So it's not as though the volume isn't there. But what we're seeing happen within the US market is unprecedented from a scale perspective. This went from almost no traffic in January and non-existent before January within the US market to suddenly putting up thousands of attacks in a given month. And to be frank, this is from our customer base. So the volumes here are based off of who we're covering within the US market. Fraud Action is a global product. So from our standpoint, the US market is a target, but not our core, not one of our core markets from a scale perspective. And what we're seeing is that the potential for the number of attacks that are going unobserved is in the tens of thousands, maybe even into hundreds of thousands per month. So the scale that we're seeing here from a phishing approach is really unprecedented based on what we've seen and based on what we've seen globally. And while this might not capture it quite as well as some of the other graphs I've seen, we're actually seeing a pattern where this is scaling almost exponentially. So every week we're seeing the attack come back with a new launch. And at this point, we're seeing that the launches are as large as what we saw in February happening in a week. So why am I even talking to you about phishing? Why does this matter to your organizations? At the end of the day, if you have good ATO controls, really, why does phishing matter? I mentioned scams, and yes, in the US market, liability has not shifted to banks. That doesn't change the fact that deposits really matter for our loan portfolios. So when we're trying to think about protecting customer assets, there's still a value when it comes to protecting customer assets. There's a value to customer experience. In a situation where a customer gets scammed, especially if it's targeting their bank specifically, that's somebody who most likely will find yourself losing as a customer. At the very least, if all of their assets are gone, then those are deposits that you were counting on that are now gone. And we know how hard it can be to bring deposits back in the front door, especially for small credit unions, small banks, community banks, where bringing customers in is sometimes a challenge. But that's exactly who they're going after here. And so it's really threatening your bottom line. You add on to that is the operational expense of dealing with this. Your customer base here is more than likely going to fall for scams. You're going to have to try to talk them out of it. This isn't just a 5-minute customer service exercise to reset their password. This is a real discussion that might take an hour with a fraud expert trying to walk them through it. These aren't $1 a minute calls. These are $5 a minute OPEX calls. And you're trying to hold their hand through it. You're trying to dig them out of a hole that they've created where they've fallen victim for the scam and they bought into it and they have sunk cost. Getting them out of that hole can sometimes be impossible. So that creates these kind of OPEX problems where you're actually talking about more like a $20 to $100 a victim kind of issue, rather than something where it's easily solved with a password reset. Not to mention, we don't necessarily know who the victims are. The phishing kits now don't leak who the victims are anymore. So we can't go back and tell you exactly who needs a password reset. We know from our own industry that we expect to see an upward of 300 victims per phishing attack, and that's a traditional phishing attack that's not as slick as this. And that's much more targeted on one specific institution. This is so broad-based that it could be generating hundreds of victims per hour. And it's set up in such a way where with a node and an attack infrastructure, even if we take down a node or even if an attack is taken down, they can redirect traffic. So the link doesn't always die and they can continue passing traffic along. They can continue victimizing. So that just keeps generating more and more customers. In our case, we've seen shutdowns for these types of attacks happen in minutes, especially since they like to leverage content delivery networks that we partner with. So this is something that can be knocked down relatively quickly, and the detection is happening remarkably fast. But that is contingent on making sure that this is something that you're responding to. So if this is something where your current digital risk protection provider is not flagging these sorts of attacks, or this is something where you're not aware of, or you're not seeing it at scale, at least from what I'm seeing in the attack lists and what I'm seeing overall, this is affecting thousands of American banks. So this is something where even a smaller institution should be seeing dozens of these attacks per month, if not more. And if that's not something being presented to you, then the attack is there. It's just a question as to whether or not your current provider is actually noticing it or providing it. And then that ultimately gets back to why even talk about this, why talk about digital risk protection, and why we need to understand what is the best practice and why. You can intercept these kind of attacks at account takeover, right? We can solve for phishing by noticing a third party coming in at login, or we can solve for scams by noticing that there's an unusual new payee on an account. And for a credit union or a small bank, noticing a new payee might be something worth taking the time to do. You have not quite as many members at the credit union, not quite as many customers for the bank. You can take the time to be a bit more boutique and to actually respond to them when you see a new payee, which would be your dead giveaway of a scam or even an account takeover fraud. But the real problem is at that point, we're cleaning up, we're reactive. We already have the customer as a victim. They've already leaked information to the scammers and to the fraudster. They're already taken in on this. And so now we're on the back foot. We're trying to clean up. We're burning operational expenses trying to clean up after the attack. We're dealing with something where the fraudster has had their chance to sink in and to really get the customer to buy in. In the case of phishing, it's something where they've managed to collect information off of the customer who they want to victimize. They've had time to prepare for it. So by the time they're coming in on account takeover, they're already really juiced up on intel and information, and so they know who their victim is going to be. On the flip side, if you can knock down the attack before they're victimizing, if you can knock down the phishing attacks before they're actually targeting the customer, if the link goes to a big red suspicious page, blocking page on Cloudflare or coming out of Chrome or Chromium browser or Safari, which is something we directly drive, then they're immediately going to abandon the flow. They're going to click the link, they're going to see something scary, they're going to go back to doing whatever they want to do. It's not worth their effort to continue going through and falling for it. They don't have any sunk cost here. They don't want to keep following it down. They've immediately been told that the jig is up right after clicking the link. So you can dispel them immediately. They don't become victims. Now, it can be hard sometimes to justify what that means downstream, and that's part of why I was trying to explain the cost of phishing. But ultimately, what this really means is you don't have to do any cleanup. The operational expense disappears. Those who get through, those who are falling victim through other means, now you can focus down your tools and solutions on those victims that are much harder to detect and much harder to work with. Those scams, which are much harder to interrupt, rather than having to deal with something at scale like this that can also be knocked down at scale. I mentioned I work for our fraud action line of business. Ultimately, this is our bread and butter. We handle detection and takedown of phishing and scams, rogue mobile apps, and malware that are targeting customers, specifically for banking and financial institutions. 80% of our client base are banking and financial institutions. We work for some of the largest brands in the planet. We're global. We've been doing this for over 20 years. And in doing so, we've built up a very strong partnership network of folks that we can work with in order to have dynamic solutions to these kind of problems. So hopefully this has been useful to everyone. I wanted to make sure that I didn't suck up everybody's time and get to the meat and potatoes of this. I'm happy to open it up at this point for question and answer, just to make sure that we answer everything that everybody's interested in, and then use that as a chance to jump in and really expound on this. So I'll start with Dana. So do we see this in business clients? So we are sometimes seeing it in platforms that would also correspond to businesses. Whether or not the mechanism would make sense to a business customer seems kind of unusual. Plaid wouldn't be the hookup I would expect to see. I haven't seen it happen I haven't seen them try to do like a QuickBooks integration or something that's Intuit flavored, but it is something where I would kind of expect to see it at some point. I don't want to give them ideas, frankly, but at some point I would expect that they're going to go after business, and at that point it would be Intuit flavored rather than Plaid. It would most likely be something that's more of a QuickBooks integration, or it would be something that's going after something more accounts payable or accounts receivable. So a direct integration to receive payment that's supposed to go directly into Ariba or directly into SAP or some of the more small business focused solutions out there that would then be able to receive it. But that's not what we're seeing today. But I think the bigger takeaway is, since we've seen this hit Interac in Canada, we've seen this morph into something else in Malaysia, we've seen this morph in Taiwan for yet another version that works in their market, and now in the US it's Plaid. This is a plug and play kit. So if they want to start doing that, if they want to start targeting business customers, if they want this to look like an invoice that's coming in to be paid, that'll directly feed into an invoice system, they can do it for sure. That phishing kit is built to do it. It's just right now they're consumer focused for now. Are there any other questions that are coming up or anything else that someone wants to bring up? Great. Well, one last thing I'll just sort of mention out there, because I think it's worth repeating, is that this is highly targeted, and this is very much focusing on smaller to medium-sized banks. This is focusing a lot more on credit unions. This is something where it's not your traditional scaled attack, right? I would expect a scaled attack that's targeting larger banks. And so this kind of sophistication that's coming down to target smaller banks, really what this reflects in my mind is, with more automation solutions, with more AI enablement, it's a lot easier to develop something that can target 3,000 smaller financial institutions and then create targeted attacks that you're rolling out at scale, as opposed to needing to realize that I only have so many development resources for my phishing attack, and so therefore I want to go after the big boys. Um, this is what I'm expecting to see as the new reality, rather than see it as something that is just going to be a flash in the pan. I think this is successful for them just based on how they continue to scale it. I don't think they would put in the effort to continue growing these attacks if it wasn't working for them. What I do expect to see is as this gets knocked down more and more, is that institutions, even smaller institutions that are doing a good job of cleaning up here, of interacting with these attacks early and shutting them down, that's going to reduce how often they're put into these attack lists. Ultimately, this is still shared infrastructure. So even when it's going after a small bank, it's not just infrastructure for one bank. They're going after a few dozen of them in their target list at a time. So if one bank is dragging down their performance, if one bank is the reason why they're getting shut down quickly and often, they'll start removing those banks from their target lists. That's ultimately the aim we're aiming for here. The point of the best practice is not so that we continue having to play whack-a-mole. The point of the best practice here is to have teeth so that they decide somebody else is a better victim. You don't have to be perfect. You just have to be better than the next bank on the block. That's how you get out from underneath these attacks. Well, hold on for just another minute to see if we have any other questions, but otherwise, so would they still depend on username and password? So from Clyde, passkey would block for the account takeover, but that's a big reason why I'm bringing up that my point is not necessarily that this is account takeover enabled. If the point was to get credentials for an account takeover, this is a very bold way to do it. I can get your credentials off of a breach set. The more common way that I've seen ATO enablement has been I will buy a breach set from an e-commerce breach or some other third-party breach, right? So somebody has gotten a hold of a bunch of usernames and passwords dumped out of somewhere. The kind of stuff you usually see Terry Hunt load into Have I Been Pwned. But by the time he gets it, it's years old. You get something fresh, and then you go and you do a cred stuffing attack, usually against a large financial institution, somewhere where almost everybody has some kind of account. And what I'm actually doing is I'm not trying to break in there. I'm actually cleaning up my data. So at this point, I go from a success rate for this breached password set where maybe 1 in every 100 passwords is actually usable. And I clean that up until it's 1 in every 10 or 1 in every 3. And then I go back to target institutions and I try them one at a time. Or I take a look at that credential and I marry it up with other breach sets that are out there to figure out who are you and where do you bank, what kind of person are you? Because I can marry it up with that kind of data and get a sense as to who really am I targeting here now that I know I have good usernames and passwords that are live. And then I'll target you specifically for that ATO, right? I'll go in and I'll come out of a proxy server that's in your area and I'll look exactly like you. That's not what I think we're seeing here. They're just going after the credential. They're trying to get other information out of the customer, specifically where they bank. This is something where they're going to target them for scamming. So this isn't just going to be an account takeover. They're not happy with just the username and password. If it was, then what this would do is it would emulate the actual login experience. So the customer is the one logging in, and they would serve their passkey through some kind of an iframe. And then at that point, they would steal the session and do a session hijack and then run with it. That's not what they're doing here. They're taking their credential, but that credential is more of a data point. Any other questions? All right. Well, I was targeting to have this last about 30 minutes. It looks like everybody gets 5 minutes back for their day. I'm always available for questions and follow-up. So if after this presentation something comes to mind, or if you'd like to have a follow-on discussion, I'm more than happy to facilitate that. Contact information should be available at the conclusion of the presentation, and you should get an email with follow-up of the recording and the presentation in case you want to revisit it or share it. Thank you very much for coming to this webinar. I really appreciate it, and I hope everyone has a lovely day and stay safe out there. Thank you.